Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. My name is John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. As always, before we get into the meat of the show, I'd like to share with you somebody who adds to the gaiety of the nations, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes literally as a specific point that he's wanted to make, but fails to make it in quite the right way. I'm talking about the President of the United States. He and the Vice President went to Quantico to talk to hundreds of generals. So picture this scene. All these generals are sitting in rows and they're being talked at by the Vice President, who is telling them there's too many fat generals. So remember, this is his audience. He's telling the audience there are too many fat people amongst them. He cares little for their reaction, which was, in fact, silence, as you might imagine. He was replaced on the podium by an enormously fat man, who, in fact, turned out to be the commander-in-chief. And you have to hand it to Trump. He is just impervious to irony. It's just the most extraordinary thing to watch him and his friends denouncing fat people standing there in all of his glory. It's just the most extraordinary thing. I wanted to share that with you because I suspect the broadcast media will find it difficult to, in fact, draw these parallels and these contrasts. But it's as well that we recognize that we're living in a world where, frankly, things are not sometimes the way they are presented to us. And in that context, we have a terrific guest tonight. Again, we'll be joined by Professor Alf Baird. And this time he'll be talking to us about colonization. Now, this is a subject which I don't see much coverage in the SNP. I don't know of anyone in the SNP running with this, but perhaps they ought. So without any further ado, let's invite Alf Baird to join us tonight. Good afternoon or good evening, Alf. How are you?
Hello, John. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. It's great for you to join us again. And where are you joining us from?
I'm from the Orkney Islands.
Terrific. You see the wonders of technology, folks. The BBC will charge you £300 million a year for what Alf and I are doing for literally a pittance, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're not being paid and I'm not being paid.
That's right. It's all voluntary.
And here we are. The technology is all available to you folks, which makes me wonder, just before we get into the meat of things and talk about colonisation, Alf, why doesn't the Scottish Government form its own broadcasting company?
Yes, well, you would expect a nationalist government to do many, many things. In the past, my research area is in ports and shipping, global trade, and I had tried to get the Scottish Government to develop ports, to develop ferry services to the continent, to develop an international dimension. But we know that the Union it's implied within many policies that internationalism is not part of Scotland's agenda. Everything, as it was once written, has to go through London. Yeah. So Scotland has to go through London to do anything. Ministers have been chided for doing anything international, as you know. So essentially the game is to keep Scotland off the international scene, out of the international scene, really. And we see that even with the football, which was never really televised for international games, for Scottish international games. Scotland was always treated as a second-class nation in that sense. So this is nothing new. Everything has to go through the metropolitan capital, and that's the colonial reality. That's imperialism for you.
But don't you think, accepting all of that, here we are, the two of us tonight, with the superb assistance of Kevin in the background as our producer. So that's the three of us. Kevin runs this whole operation on a shoestring. I wish it wasn't that way. I wish, for example, that he was being avalanched in funding, but it's not the case. So he ekes out all of this and makes it possible and does it so professionally. I mean, for example, I make no great claims, and I'm sure Kevin wouldn't either, to the fact that we have no blemishes when we do this program. Of course, we make mistakes. But then I look at the mainstream broadcasters and I see people sort of stumbling and bumbling and bumping into furniture. And I think, hold on a second, I'm paying £300 million a year for this.
Well, that's right. We recently, I was in Geneva at the United Nations at the Human Rights Council, and we were part of a seminar, and we had a seminar on self-determination of Scotland and why Scotland's self-determination is continually blocked by Westminster, which is against international law and principles of the United Nations, self-determination of peoples. And one of the presentations was actually on broadcasting in Scotland, and it was entitled Broadcasting, I think, in a Colony by David Henry. And he went through all the processes and mechanisms of broadcasting within Scotland, which is all, as you know, controlled by London, with very little expenditure in Scotland, especially on things like dramas. All the dramas are classic English dramas and all this thing is largely employing people from outside Scotland and on issues in literature and English studies and language, which is not Scots, to be frank. So we get these programs beamed into our living rooms all the time, but essentially we're not even at the standard of the German Länder. The states, no. Each of the German Länder has powers over broadcasting within each state. And can influence things to do with language and broadcasting agendas and so on. Whereas Scotland really gets everything chucked at it from London, and that's basically it. And we saw that also. In fact, Craig Murray's speech in Geneva also mentioned the broadcasting blitz during the referendum, which was enormously in favour of the British state, but anti-independence. And that was written about by many people, including Professor Robertson and other people who actually published books on it. One, I think, was called The Propaganda Blitz, which swayed people's minds. So it wasn't a referendum that was not that was neutral. It wasn't a referendum for a self-determination should be, according to the United Nations, it should be avoiding external interference. That's what it calls it, external interference. We also had dozens of MPs from Westminster coming up campaigning. We had London-based financial institutions campaigning and threatening Scots that they would lose jobs and investment. We had all sorts of influence externally. And this is what a UN-sanctioned referendum, for example, would seek to avoid, would seek to prevent all this influence from outside Scotland on the right of a people to determine their own governance and future.
I mean, it is very odd. I mean, the UK, by and large, handles its constitution very badly. I mean, it's almost impossible. I mean, I've been watching a recent series called Hack with David Tennant, who is outstanding, by the way. I'm not here to promote any particular actor, but I have to tell you, he's awfully good as a London-based journalist, trying to get to the foot of what Rupert Murdoch and his cronies were up to, which eventually led to the demise of the News of the World. And he, at every turn, he was thwarted by the powers that be. I mean, half of his time was spent persuading people to do the jobs they should have been doing anyway. And as for the regulation, I mean, only tonight I saw an actor who was deeply involved in this, and he was saying, look, Labour Party promised people for 5 years, while the Tories were in power, that they would implement the legislation, which had been agreed, but there was a tiny little piece of the Act which required the Secretary of State to say commence. And that never happened. No. So the legislation never happened. And it was very sad. I mean, it's and for 5 years, Labour promised these folks that they would enact it as soon as they got into power. But of course, as soon as they get into power, they find themselves lockstep with the media, and they become frightened.
Well, you mentioned the Constitution, John. At the same seminar in Geneva on Scottish self-determination, We had legal minds there, top legal minds, Professor Robert Black and also Ailsa Graves, a corporate lawyer, talking about the non-treaty, as it were, and talking about the UK Constitution, which is largely made up as it seems to be made up as it goes along, and it has that tremendous flexibility to do pretty much anything. But a lot of the countries that were attending that seminar, and non-self-governing territories too, could recognize colonized people being handed a worthless treaty, which legalizes colonialism domestically. It's always been the case with the British state and the French as well that they will hand native groups treaties which are immediately violated, immediately pretty much worthless, and cast into the dustbin of history, but and rephrased and readjusted as they like. So Scotland has been left in that condition with that treaty, just like any other colonized people, and all these other territories recognize this. We put a lot of attachment to the Treaty of Union, but it's a very one-sided, biased arrangement, as we know. And Professor Black's synthesis of this, what actually happened, was quite revealing, in the sense that England's Parliament simply continued after the treaty. Scotland's Parliament was dissolved. England's ambassadors all continued after the treaty. Scotland's ambassadors all disappeared, if they even existed. But the other thing was that all the treaties of England continued after the Treaty of Union, all the previous treaties, whereas all the previous treaties of Scotland were no longer recognised. So basically what you had was England continuing in all its forms, even its speaker, there wasn't even an election at the Treaty of Union. So all the MPs just continued. And it was simply, in Professor Black's view, an annexation of Scotland. So this is what we're dealing with today, is a legacy of simply annexation of a territory and people. And other speakers like Sarah Salyers talked about the territorial alienation, which in international law is a critical feature. Scotland's territory has just been used and abused and exploited to no end ever since. But it wasn't necessarily a territorial union as such. It was a political union, but the sovereign territory of Scotland still remains a sovereign territory, but it's not respected in that sense. And the treaty has given Westminster the mechanism and its own authority, self-authority, to do as it wishes.
I want to come back to some of these things, Alf, but I'd like to take a few questions as we go along.
Yeah.
One question is to ask Alf which countries sit on the UN C24 committee.
Well, there's quite a few countries sit on the C24 committee, but I don't know them all. But there are quite a few. I think, well, there's quite a few smaller countries, former colonies, and so on. I think Fiji is one of them, and there's many other countries in the Pacific, the Caribbean, from Africa, and so on. There are a couple of European countries as well, but not many. So there's quite a variety of countries.
Yeah, I want to take a question from Gregor as well. He's asking what you think about the fact that Scotland was an active participant in the British Empire.
Well, yeah, that's always mentioned by people who are sold that line by whoever, the media. The prevailing narrative is that Scotland was part of colonialism. But I think when we look at the reality, what we see is that colonialism is also about using the resources of colonies. For example, in the military, Scotland provided a very large military force, as did Ireland, and to some extent Wales, as did India, as did Kenya, as did many other Nigerians as well. The Royal Niger Company used African tribes, trained them up, gave them a gun and some money to shoot natives. And this is what actually happened. And Niger are still dealing with French aggression in that area today, even as it was discussed at the UN this week. So colonialism, let's remember, is always a cooperative venture with native elites as well. And Scotland's native elite at the time had already become largely anglicised after the union of the crowns a century previously. So the education of the aristocracy was already begun. They were already English in all respects, largely. and already living in English estates or London as well as Scottish estates. So the aristocracy were already part of that racket. And so let's remember that is the fact. Colonialism is always a cooperative venture with native elites. And down the lower levels of the society as well is used for productive purposes. The people are used for supplying the mother country with everything it needs, foodstuff, military components, shipping, all the rest of it. And we know the narrow industrial specialisation Scotland followed in mining, engineering, shipbuilding, and that was largely to supply the mother country. And this is what it's all about. And the armed force as well was one of these supplies. In addition to that, of course, we had one of the biggest out-migrations in Europe. For a country of our size, 3 to 4 million people were pushed out of Scotland one way or another, initially through clearances, transportations, forced transportations, all the rest of it. Then Empire Resettlement Acts, where Westminster passed acts to provide incentives for Scots to leave. And this is known as banishment of the natives, and that is part of the colonial process. At the same time, you have an import of a meritocratic elite, largely from metropolitan capital, and all the best jobs, as we know in Scotland throughout my career, were always advertised in the London press. They weren't necessarily advertised in what was a declining Scottish press. So the Times Higher Education Supplement is where all the jobs in Scotland are, in education, for example. That's why half the teachers in parts of Scotland are from England. Most of the academics, we've discussed before, 90% of the academics in Scotland are not Scots. Scotland has a meritocratic elite, therefore, that reflects the culture, the language, the values of some other country.
Does that also, Alf, read across into the civil service?
Well, of course. And what actually happens with home rule, and this has happened in many different colonies, including the French departments, is when the native population managed to convince the imperial, the authority, the power to provide them with some kind of devolved assembly or executive or whatever it's called. It provides also an opportunity for thousands of civil servants to be sent from the mother country into the territory. And that's what always happened in the French territories. And it's also what's happened in Scotland. So we have a civil service that's also been pushing thousands of civil servants out of London up to Edinburgh since devolution. What this actually does is it solidifies the power of the colonial entity. It solidifies their power base within the territory itself. It makes life actually makes it more difficult to liberate the people, to get independence. It's because all the mechanisms are there in place to hold it tight. And that's what we know the Union has been in place to do with Scotland, even since the Speaker announced it himself in 1707, that we have held Scotland, we have catched Scotland and will hold her tight. And that's exactly what they've done. And we know why that is, because it all comes back to the fundamental objective of colonialism, which is economic exploitation. It's done in different ways, politically, psychologically, culturally, and so on. And we might get to things like the colonial mindset. But the fact is, there remains that the main purpose of colonialism, whether it's an African territory, an Asian territory, or whether it's a European territory, is economic plunder.
And you reckon, too, that the National Party is part of this process?
Well, the post-colonial theory tells us that is invariably what happens is the people put their faith in a dominant national party. In our case, it's had 6 majorities for independence or mandates for another referendum, 3 at Holyrood, 3 at Westminster. Bear in mind also that as recently as the 1990s, we were being told by John Major and previously Mrs. Thatcher and Norman Tebbit and everybody else on the Tory front bench that Scotland can have our independence when we elect a majority of nationalist MPs. And that was all up front. Everybody knew that. And that goes back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s and the campaigns for home rule and conventions. So we know all that. But what happens in post-colonial theory is once the dominant national party gets these majorities, it sometimes seeks an accommodation with colonialism. It is, especially when you get a form of indirect rule, which is the devolved assembly. The devolved parliament is what Lord Lugard described in India and African countries as indirect rule, Egypt and so on. You create indirect rule, so you elect some of the native people and the elites to manage affairs for London, for Paris, or wherever the metropolitan capital is. But essentially, they keep the racket going. It's just basically to keep things ticking over, to keep the economic exploitation going, the cultural oppression going, all the rest of it. And that's exactly what we see. The National Party beds in, it builds up its pensions, it keeps the colonial racket going. It sometimes also behaves like a gang, because we have to remember the people see this. The people realize something has gone wrong. It ruptures the independence movement, for example, and we see new national parties being created. We have many new national parties in Scotland now, and at the next election we might see 6 or 7 national parties competing for votes. And we have the dominant national party is still the least innovative, the least willing to challenge the status quo. In fact, it's protecting the status quo. That's its role, essentially now, is to maintain the status quo and to be, in effect, neutral on independence.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the impression I get, that the Scottish government sees governing Scotland through the wrong end of a municipal drain pipe. We will now devote ourselves entirely to moving things around on this tiny little piece of the chessboard that we have, but we will never seek to have actually ownership of the chessboard. We're happy to move a couple of 3 pieces.
The tragedy as well is the outcome of colonialism is to widen inequality.
Yeah.
And John Swinney maintains his, and previous leaders have maintained their priority is to eradicate inequality. But they cannot do this in a colonial financial straitjacket, because they have not got the levers of power of the whole economy. They can't touch corporation tax. They can't touch VAT. And we know that our GDP is half what it should be. It's half what it should be. It's less than half of Ireland and Norway. It's not far off 50%, 60% less than Denmark. Denmark doesn't have the same resources as Scotland. Scotland's got enormous resources. It's on a par with Norway, at least, if not more. Norway doesn't have things like we have, like the whiskey or even the abundance of renewables and other aspects, tourism as well. So Scotland is enormously wealthy, but we're missing a couple of £100 billion out of the pot. And this was also demonstrated the last time Scotland's accounts were actually published in the 1920s by Westminster, which showed that Scotland only got returned 28% of its revenues.
But you see, this is where a lot of people just don't understand. 2 things, and we were talking about reporting results. Why does the Scottish government continue to produce GERS when everyone knows that it's false and it's not accurate and it has all these flaws, etc.? I mean, it's been rubbished by just about every sensible economist. And
I think the problem with the SNP is they don't behave like a nationalist government should.
Yeah.
For a start, they take their lead from the Whitehall civil servants who are sent here to manage the institutions. Now, these people come up here to manage the institutions, obviously in the interests of London, not in the interests of Scotland. And I dealt with civil servants in high level in transport, ferries, I hate to say, ports and all the rest of it. And they were all giving us the London line on policy.
Yeah.
Policy was not about developing the Scottish economy, as I said, to internationalise, to develop. It's an underdeveloped economy. It was all about serving England, serving the mother country, whether it's feeder flights to Heathrow or containers going to Felixstowe in London, Gateway. It's all the same. And using England's supply chain to supply everything to Scotland as well. So we sell everything out cheap or below cost. Everything leaves the colony at low cost. It's taken out, it's extracted, whether that's oil and gas, renewables, whiskey, aggregates, everything. And anything that comes in, and remember, our economy is dominated by one supply chain, that's up the M6 or the West Coast Main Line. That's our supply chain, really. 99%, 90% of everything's coming in that way. And that's all coming up at high cost, at monopoly providers, supermarkets and everything else. So Scotland needs to do what other former colonies did, like Ireland, New Zealand, Australia. Once they get independence, they reorientate their trade away from the mother country. They don't get everything supplied from London. They get everything supplied from the best, most competitive producer. And the other thing that makes us extremely uncompetitive is we have the highest energy costs in the world, much higher than all the other oil and gas developing nations. And I've compared them. And our electricity prices are 4 times as high as Norway. So we cannot possibly compete in the international market. John Swinney can never make Scotland's economy competitive. That's why we see zero economic growth. We see no economic growth. All we see is contraction, Grangemouth, everything else. All we see is a reduction in economic activity.
So, if you, given all of that, Alf, it's a very clear exposition of where we stand and what needs to change. How would you change it?
Well, a nationalist government should be more forceful. And I think even Alex Salmond could have been more forceful, although was a lot more forceful than his successors. But they needed to install really a Scottish civil service. And that's what Northern Ireland has, a Northern Ireland civil service. They don't depend on Whitehall for their civil servants in Northern Ireland. So Scotland should have done the same. And with nationalist majorities, they should have forced that through. And then they should have developed an international agenda, irrespective of what London says.
But isn't that what Angus Robertson is doing?
No, he's not. He's not developing an international agenda at all. If he was developing an international agenda, we would see direct ferry connections every day to the continent. We would see these energy pipelines to the continent. We would see a lot more maybe international diplomacy as well at the United Nations. Where, for example, is Scotland's permanent representation at the United Nations? You know, I've been at the United Nations recently, as you know, with a lot of people in Liberation Scotland and Salvo and others supporting us, and many other countries there to give their views. And it's clear that the SNP have never done anything like that. Mike Russell could have, as Constitutional Minister Secretary years ago, developed a permanent representation at the UN. Because let's remember that independence could also be defined as becoming a UN member state. That's our aspiration, is to become a UN member state. Because if you're accepted as a UN member state, you must then be sovereign and your entity is then independent.
But you can't become a UN member state if you are independent, isn't that right?
Well, that's right. You have to be independent first. And that's why...
So it's a circular argument.
It is a circular argument, but there's nothing to stop national governments, particularly, or national entities as we have here, especially elected ones, from having status at the UN, even observer status. There's plenty of NGOs willing to assist countries like Scotland to decolonise, to fulfill the self-determination, the granting of independence to colonial countries. That is there.
Isn't it a strange, I want to come back to in a second what happened in Geneva, but isn't it a rather strange anomaly, if that's the right expression, that here we have a government that's timid when it comes to the Constitution, timid to the extent of not having any involvement in changing the Constitution, I assume that they take the Scotland Act as holy writ, and therefore it cannot be challenged in any way, shape or form. That particular type of party, of the kind that you've described as being common elsewhere at certain times, is riding very high in the polls. I mean, the Labour Party would give its right arm for the sort of numbers that John Swinney has just now. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realise yet that they may have alternatives at the upcoming election as well. And there are, as I mentioned, other independence parties who are willing to stand on a mandate that they will declare independence should a majority of seats be be won by independence candidates, by nationalist candidates. There is already, as we know, some of a rebellion within the SNP, the remaining members, at the forthcoming conference, to have the same strategy for a declaration of independence after a majority of nationalist MSPs are elected, and also giving a date for independence of the 1st of May 2027, providing within that 1 year some room for negotiations with the British government, but also stating that if these negotiations don't come to anything, they would still declare independence. What we were doing at the United Nations is informing other member states and other agencies, international agencies, to do with human rights and other aspects, and self-determination as a human right, of Scotland's real situation. Not a lot of countries know Scotland's real situation. Not a lot of countries and peoples around the world are aware of the difficulties that Scotland faces. Not a lot of countries are aware that of the economic plunder, the political control, the cultural control, and the other health and social aspects that are very severely affecting people in Scotland, and have done for centuries.
Yeah.
The out-migration as well, and also the atrocities and the previous wars of independence of the 1800s. Scotland's been all through the same processes that many other countries have been through, and countries like Palestine are actually going through. Scotland has been through a lot of that already in its past, although our history has been rewritten. So the mechanism is there through self-determination. It really is a big worry that the SNP are not using that door, because that door is always there. As
you said earlier, it's not just the present administration. If you go all the way back, well, some people have argued that it was a real mistake to rechristen the Scottish executive, the Scottish government, because it really isn't. It is still an executive. It carries out.
That's
actions.
Right. It's even got a franchise for a council. It's got a council franchise, what's called a local government franchise, which basically means anybody with an address in Scotland can vote on our constitution, which is not allowable. It's highly irregular globally. It is normally people who could vote on the constitution are restricted to nationals of that country. That's another aspect that the Scottish government could have been doing, is to define who are the nationals of Scotland. Who are the nationals? Who should have a right to constitutional votes? I mean, certainly in other countries, it's always the case that people, maybe everybody has a right in a municipal election if you live in that country. A lot of people have a right to vote in a national election, but constitutional matters are always reserved for the nationals of that country. Why? Because if you don't do that, and if your population fundamentally changes, you can lose your sovereignty. And this is why countries will not allow a local government franchise for a sovereign matter. Even Ireland, people from this country living in Ireland cannot vote on a constitutional matter. They can't even vote on EU elections now because we are out of the EU, dragged out of the EU. I think
this is what I mean about the lack of opportunism. I mean, we had the referendum. A number of commitments were made. They were not honoured. Nobody really objected terribly much. I mean, if I hear John Swinney say, "I'm appalled" one more time, honestly, I'm going to be dreadfully ill, because being appalled is not the same as doing something about it. Yeah. In fact, it's the opposite.
But also you can see by the policies the SNP have been following the last decade, none of them further independence. They take the people up a blind alley, and this is what the post-colonial theory tells you. Yeah.
I looked at all the missed opportunities. I mean, you can go on, but Brexit was the classic. When this was discussed in Parliament, as I understand it, Alex Salmond was given a cast iron. He was told cast iron guarantee. If Scotland voted otherwise, then we'd have to make other arrangements. When it actually came to the vote, they just said, "Who cares?"
Well, this is it.
That was the point at which I would have thought somebody would have said in the Scottish government, "I'm sorry, you cut a deal. This was a deal. You're not going to honour it, and therefore we're not going to honour something else." And you then take action.
Well, that's right. The National Party have to stand up for its principles, if it has any, and these were principles and points that should have brought the union to an end. Certainly over Brexit, we know that, and we had the power to do that because the SNP were handed the majorities. They were given the majorities, but they never used the political sovereignty to do what a nationalist government should do. They simply sat and accepted it, and this is. The problem that this causes is that actually when the National Party delays independence, it creates the conditions for further problems down the road, even for conflict in some cases, because the people see what's happening. And we can see that the SNP is struggling at the moment with its agenda. Although it might well be voted in as the major party next year, a lot of people won't be voting for it if they don't come up with some kind of cohesive strategy for independence. Yeah. And it looks like they're doing everything they can to avoid a cohesive strategy for independence. It looks like they're just looking for more of the same. And this is what's upsetting the movement largely. And that's why a lot of people are now going to be standing for the Liberate Scotland initiative, which is not related to, connected to Liberation Scotland, UN initiative. The Liberate Scotland is a multi-party initiative, Sovereignty Party, Independent Scotland Party, and Independence for Independence. So there's more than 20 or 30 candidates going to be standing that will, if you vote for them, they will declare independence, irrespective of what the SNP do.
It's going to be a fascinating time. I mean, I think what people find difficult to understand is sticking to a position which says that you're going to call for negotiation when the other guy you plan to negotiate with appears on your television saying, I want to negotiate. That presupposes that somehow you have some magic wand that changes this guy.
A nationalist government at the end of the day has to stand up for its people. It has to stand up against the imperial power that's running the show. And if they fail to do that, then colonialism and assimilation just continues. Yeah. And the problem with the continuation is that that cultural assimilation is one of the processes that actually can destroy a nation. And so we don't teach our languages, really. We don't teach a Scots language. That's marginalized and made invalid, as are the speakers who speak it. So that's one of the key ingredients of national identity as well. So although there's recently been a Scots Language Act, it's very, very weak. And it doesn't have resources. It doesn't have resources. What we need is actually Scots language teachers in every school, and Gaelic for people who want to speak Gaelic as well. The initiative at the moment is pushing Gaelic, but that's relatively a minority group within Scotland. It's the main bulk of the people who support independence, as well as I've found, as the Scots speakers, people who have a Scottish identity. Yeah. And that's what colonialism tells us. Is, again, independence is really a cultural emotion. It's about your culture, like your identity, largely. And that's what the independence movement is based on, is the people with a Scottish identity. And that goes back to the franchise as well. Whereas if you open up the franchise to people who simply have an address here, students from abroad, people coming to work for a year or two, or people coming to retire from other countries, what they did last time is most of them, 70–80% of people, certainly from the rest of the UK, voted against independence. Yeah. And that number is now increasing quite rapidly. Yeah. So although we think younger people might vote more so for independence, there is a large population of people now in Scotland that's been built up over the last 10–15 years, even longer, that are naturally anti-independence. Yeah. The difficulty with that as well is that, you know, we have this concept of civic nationalism, which the SNP has been following, which assumes that people that come to live here have a sense of belonging to the nation. But for those people who vote against our self-determination, against our independence, they don't want a Scottish citizenship, obviously, because they're rejecting it. They're rejecting a Scottish nationality.
Not all of them reject it.
Yeah, not all of them, but those who vote, those who vote against independence are obviously rejecting a Scottish nationality.
They are, but not everyone who comes here voted that way.
No, that's right.
I know lots of people who voted for independence who weren't born here.
No, I think, but the post-referendum research that was done found that certainly in the rest of the UK, about 70% voted against.
And we're still talking about voting, but not in a referendum this time. We're talking about voting like in the next Scottish elections. Mm-hmm. Would it make sense for the non-SNP party, if I can call them that, to appear on the list vote only and not on the straightforward member vote?
Well, yeah, that was always the argument also used by Alba with Alex Salmond to get the supermajority, was to have the SNP vote for nationalist inclined people to vote for SNP on the constituency and Alba on the list, or other independence parties on the list, and then to develop a supermajority using the D'Hondt system allows to do that, as we know through various analyses. But that's again calls into question the SNP strategy, which is to say vote SNP 1 and 2, and we know that through successive elections that the second vote is wasted when you vote when the party in the constituency is gathering most of the constituency seats. So that calls into question that strategy. But I think it's possible that a vote for the list is the preferred option, and also I think it's part of the SNP rebel strategy to have the numbers on the list as if a majority of the people voting on the list vote for independence parties, then should also be regarded as a mandate for independence.
Yeah, I think some people listening to you would probably think, this is an awfully complicated way of doing it. Why doesn't the SNP just get its finger out and go for independence? Why don't the people within the SNP say to the leadership, because after all, as far as I can gather, when I was in the SNP, that the members controlled the party. Now, if there's still a semblance of that being accurate, then that suggests that the members are sovereign and therefore they can require the leadership to respect their wishes. Have I got that wrong? Is that naive?
No, but you're right. But going back to the post-colonial theory, it tells us what the National Party does. And especially if it's there are people within the National Party that are not exactly batting for Scotland, they're maybe batting for the other side.
But again, I'm returning to the point that surely that's the responsibility of the people within the SNP.
Well, it is the sense, although it seems that their own national organisational structure has been managed in such a way that ordinary members do not have much of a say. And that's basically
their fault, though.
Yes, that's basically, and that's why so many people have left the SNP. Remember, they've lost half the members.
You either change the thing from within or you change it from without.
Yeah, well, that's right.
There's a logic that says it probably makes more sense to change it from within.
Yeah, the other reality here in the post-colonial theory is that at the decisive moment of independence, and that is a decisive moment. For example, when in 2015, when 56 SNP MPs were elected, that was a decisive moment, and they didn't take that opportunity. And the theory tells you that at that time, quite often the National Party elite suffer from a kind of petrifaction. They are feared. They are scared of taking that step. And this is the problem we have. And so instead of Salmond's 56 roaring lions, we had 56 pussycats, as it were, sitting on the benches, behaving themselves and being good parliamentarians in London. And that's not what independence is about. Independence depends on political leadership. And what we have now is a political leadership that basically leaves independence to future events. It doesn't move. It doesn't move strategically. It doesn't seek innovation. There are many innovations for independence. As we can see, there's innovations like the list vote next year. There's the supermajority. There's using the United Nations. SNP are not involved in any of these initiatives to move forward. They're not involved in, which means that they are content with the status quo. And that is the reality of the situation. What the people decide to do in May, I have no idea. But recent elections, a lot of the independence movement voters haven't turned out.
Yeah. Let's talk about what you guys did in Geneva. What happened? Who was there? And what do you think the effect was of you being there?
Yeah, I think that was largely to inform the international community of Scotland's condition, Scotland's situation, and to seek support for self-determination, if you like, which is, remember, is being blocked. So we covered the legal ground, the political ground, economic ground, cultural ground, human rights ground. All these aspects were disclosed and discussed. Also, the markers of colonialism. The economic plunder, the underdevelopment of the nation, the cultural damage, the health aspects, the poverty, the deprivation, even high prison populations and so on, are all parts of that reality. Now, we had a lot of people there from other countries, and including member states, but also from other non-self-governing territories that are listed, and other territories that want to be listed, the same as Scotland, the same as Liberation Scotland.
Who was in that category?
Well, we had different Caribbean islands there. We had people from the Tamil people. We had people from the African nations. The African Association, ECOSOC, consists of 55 nations, 53 of them former colonies, and we had the chair of that organization. We attended some other events as well to do with ECOSOC, the African decolonization process, and also we attended other events to do with Palestine too, which has features of colonialism as well, strong features of colonialism, where colonialism eventually goes back to its roots, which is racism and fascism. And these are the roots of colonialism, is the basis of fascism as well, according to historians. So, and the British and French and the Americans have all been involved in various injustices throughout the last century and more. So we know this situation as it transpires. So we had a lot of people there who understood colonialism.
Okay. But did they understand, or did they accept your contention that Scotland is a colony?
Yes, I think in large part the features of Scotland were well explained. Even the treaty aspects could be recognised by a lot of other peoples around the world, which were handed a worthless treaty, the same as the Scots. So yeah, all these features were the same: the outmigration, the management of the natives, the economic plunder, the underdevelopment of the country. I mean, look at our infrastructure; it's pretty crumbling and nasty. Victorian railways, lack of ports, all of these features feature heavily in underdeveloped colonized territories. So we have the same situation, and also the pressure from the imperial power to stop and or delay independence. It wants to delay independence, especially with Scotland now, where we're on the threshold of a renewables revolution, which will be earning by 2030 over 100 billion a year in retail value of kilowatt hours. That's what that's worth. Over 100 billion a year. It will dwarf oil and gas. And that's going to be a rather big asset for the next 30, 40, 50 years plus, of which Scotland will not enjoy. We are not enjoying that asset. In fact, we are penalised, we are punished, we are made dependent. We are made dependent on energy which is taken out and then given back at high cost. So all these things were recognised, whether it's Nigeria, Kenya, whether it's a Caribbean island, whether it's a country in Asia. All of these things were recognised. It's the same process every time.
So what happens next?
Well, we have other contact. What Liberation Scotland are looking for is, and still looking for, is to develop links with a friendly nation who might sponsor a resolution at the United Nations to seek Scotland to be listed for non-self-governing status, non-self-governing territory status, which is basically a colony, and then has the right under the UN legislation and charter to bring forward schemes for decolonization, for independence, through the UN mechanisms as well, and to seek support from the UN agencies themselves, who I admit are under a lot of pressure at the moment, and there's a lot of concern about the need for the UN to be reformed and to be strengthened in many cases. And I think on colonization, decolonization, it's taken its foot off the gas a wee bit in the last couple of decades, because there's a lot of people queuing up there still to look for support. And as well as that, the imperial powers seem to be renewing their strength and their aggression and their appetite to exploit countries around the world and peoples. So the UN has to understand that this process is deteriorating in that sense. And also the UN was created largely to remove the powers of the great imperial powers and to decolonize. That's what it was largely created for.
And it did a good job. I mean, there was massive decolonization.
Yes. Well, a lot of this legislation, a lot of this came in the 1960s.
What do you think the result of these geopolitical changes, and I'm thinking particularly of Trump here now, what do you think the impact will be there?
Well, I think it's very worrying. The neo-colonialism, as it's coming out now, is basically the same as the old colonialism, but worse in the sense that of the military equipment and military effects and the devastation that this levels cities and all the rest of it. So it's a very worrying thing. But also you have competing forces. If we go back to Roman times, and we know this is also in the creation of the United Nations, the only bulwark against imperialism is the nations. That is the bulwark, and that's why we had the United Nations. But now we see another bloc creating, and the BRICS and so on. We have in my area, I can recognize the approach of China and other countries, Brazil and some African countries, to developing trade. And this was always the agenda of the UN, was to develop trade and peace through trade, not through imperialism, to get rid of imperialism and to end the scourge of colonialism. And Scotland's been one of the longest colonial examples that we can see. 3 centuries is a long time. That's twice as long as New Caledonia. And they're on the list of territories. So we have this. So we have the BRICS focus on trade, port development, transport infrastructure development, trade and peace through trade as well. And I think that's the area that we need to focus on globally.
And you think you also have a friendly country out there who might be interested in sponsoring Scotland?
Well, yes, we one of the things about Scots, and Craig Murray emphasised this as well, he appeared in full Highland dress and everybody applauded and everybody loved it, and people were taking selfies all the way through the UN with Craig. And it's because Scots are really liked throughout the world. And he made the point that Scotland's international diplomacy would be fundamentally different from London. Scotland, we would be more like Ireland, he said, and this is true. And remember, since independence, Ireland has avoided more than 80 conflicts that London has dragged Scotland into. And none of these conflicts were really, maybe with the exception of the World War II, none of these conflicts were strategic for Scotland. Most of them were decolonization conflicts to try and keep a hold of the goodies they were getting out of Kenya or India or Pakistan, and also leading to tremendous problems afterwards through partition. Ireland as well.
But South Korea doesn't fall into that category.
Yeah, I don't know so much about Korea, but I think it's more American influence there is dominant in Korea.
So in your independent Scotland would not be a member of NATO, I take it.
Well, I don't know. That's really a matter for the Scottish people. But NATO, as it stands, is really a difficult entity to embrace with its involvement in Ukraine and other countries in the former Eastern Bloc, trying to impose defense systems or aggressive systems of force there, right on Russia's border, which goes against things like the Minsk Agreement. And all these things were violated. So the Soviet Union decolonized many areas, but that was on the basis of the agreement with the West that they wouldn't stick NATO on their doorstep. And this relates also to the Americans' Monroe Doctrine, which you wouldn't want to stick the same kind of systems in Mexico or Canada on their doorstep, or Cuba. So yeah, I think there's a whole different. The geopolitics is not necessarily my area, but it's a very fluid aspect, And I think I always link it back to trade and development. The countries that are doing really well are the countries that have invested in ports, shipping, trade, and developed their economies. And this is the problem for the old imperial nations. Their economies are collapsing. America, France, Britain, much of Europe, their economies are collapsing. And the ones that are still have this imperial mindset, they're grabbing the goodies around the world. They're trying to develop, to get in on the rackets that they've maintained for decades and centuries, in fact, with elites around the world, colonial elites, even in some countries that have decolonized. A lot of the West African countries that have decolonized are still locked into trading with France and so on, and using the connections there against the interests of the people. So I think this is a factor of, the traditional global imperial powers are collapsing economically, but this is their last the last throw of the dice, in a sense. Their aggressiveness.
What's going to replace that model, do you think?
Well, I think we have to get a new model, and this is what a lot of the debates at the UN last week with the leadership and the other nations was about. The 189 heads of state and others who presented was about reforming the United Nations to take account of global changes. And we can see the old imperial powers are still there in their aggressive colonialism. We have to move towards the new world order, which is developing trade and peaceful connection, peaceful relations, but through trade and development, and respecting sovereignty of nations, and not getting involved in the military interventions that we see Britain involved in and France involved in and America, constantly involved in military interventions and the regime change and all these other things that create conflict.
I take it you don't agree with this notion that the days of the nation state have gone.
No, I think the UN is a bit like, the UN it's got almost 200 member states, but in the world today, there's a lot of other nations that could join. There's a lot of other peoples that would want autonomy. Everybody from, even the Catalans, Corsica, there's all sorts of peoples that are not happy with their current arrangements. The Scots, as a classic example, Wales as well. A new reformed United Nations could be a lot bigger. And it could lead to a new renaissance in global trade and peaceful development, as opposed to militarization. And where the only outcome, as we see in Gaza, where it goes colonialism goes the full length, goes the full distance, is where the colonizer treats the people like animals, but in that process, they become animals themselves. So what we're seeing there is just animalistic behavior, barbarism, and that's the root of colonialism, is fascism.
Yeah, it is really. I mean, it's an awful situation, and a lot of people slightly despair. I mean, I'm not one of them. I think there's always hope for a better future, because I think unless you believe that, you succumb to what the other guy wants to see you succumb to, which is unquestioning compliance, which is not a healthy place to be. I think we should all participate as best we can in the different processes. Well, we're almost through, Alf. Thank you. It's been a great session again. It's always a delight to speak with you. And I think we didn't manage to get through, all the questions, but we got through a whole bunch of them. And no doubt people can follow up with you if they want later on. But lots of people have said that it's a good show, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much to you, all the way from Orkney, and me all the way from where I'm all the way from.
Thank you very much.
A great pleasure. And keep us up to speed with what's happening, please.
Very much will do, yeah.
Thank you again. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
And good night to all of you watching and listening tonight. I'll leave you with the usual thought. Please look after each other, take care, stay safe, and remember, there's always a Scotland. Take care. Good night, everyone.